Hello and welcome to what will be the first part in an eventual 3 or 4 part series on Frank Zappa. This is partially to make up for the fact that I've been hyping up this beginner's guide to Zappa that, let's face it, is just unfortunately not going to happen. It took too long and I kind of lost focus. This will be much simpler. I haven't determined exactly what the sequence is going to be after this first album, but today I will be reviewing Freak Out by the Mothers of Invention. This is the third time I've reviewed this album, but I'm hoping this will be the definitive time. I may or may not take down my other reviews of this. Freak Out is one of those albums. It's a famous album. It deserves to be a famous album. A lot can be said about it. Freak Out is one of the best pieces of evidence for the argument that there was just something different about the mid to late 1960s, that there was something very special about that time, something very unique, and something that really has gone away, and something that's probably never going to really come back. You know, don't get me wrong, fantastic music is still being made today, but the kind of circumstances that led to this album are so fascinating and so unique. But to understand why Freak Out is so special, you have to understand that Freak Out is not only a double album, one of either the first or second in the history of rock music, something I'll get into a little bit later, but it's also a debut double album by a completely unknown artist. And Freak Out is very much Zappa, almost fully formed. I won't say that it's fully formed because the songwriting wasn't quite there, which we'll get into much more in the individual track reviews, but I think some of that has to do with the band. This version of the Mothers were effectively a bar band that got co-opted by Zappa. He's supposed to have made this bargain with them, this almost Faustian bargain, that if you play my music, I will make you rich and famous. And so they decided to play his music. And eventually they got spotted by Tom Wilson, who was famously Bob Dylan's producer up to Bringing It All Back Home. Well, he did also produce the song Like a Rolling Stone. And the story goes, a famous story, that he saw the band performing Trouble Every Day and thought that they were a out there, socially conscious blues band in the mold of something like the Rolling Stones, who were all the rage in America at the time. And so he quickly signed them to Verve, and then swiftly realized upon bringing them into the recording studio and them starting to cut Who Were the Brain Police, that he had signed something completely different altogether. It's also famously been reported that Tom Wilson was also on acid while he was producing the album. And he is officially credited as the producer here, although I think it's generally regarded that Zappa did a lot of the production here himself. One of the aspects of this album that's not really talked about is the fact that Zappa had production experience, and he had quite a bit of songwriting experience before this album. So the accomplishment of this album on Zappa's end is, in my opinion, a little bit less remarkable than has sometimes been reported. Honestly, the fact that Verve let him make it at all is the remarkable thing to me. Verve was, by this time, entering kind of a death spiral. They were a jazz label, but it seems like they tried to branch out into rock in the 60s. The Velvet Underground were also on Verve, and this album's release was apparently marked the beginning of the Lou Reed-Frank Zappa feud. Because the Velvet Underground and Nico was recorded at about the same time as Freak Out, but held back for another year. And Lou Reed seemed to believe that Frank Zappa had conspired with Verve executives to hold back the VU and Nico so that Freak Out could be released in 1966, which I'm not sure of at all. Judging by some of the problems Zappa had with Verve later on, I can't really see him being too cozy with them. The last thing that has to be noted before I go to the individual track reviews, and this is a huge thing. One of the problems with all of my previous reviews of Freak Out is that I reviewed the album based on the mix that is available on the CD today. This is a remix that Frank made in the 80s that changed quite a bit about the sound of Freak Out. What I will be using in this video, what I will be pointing out in terms of the differences, is the Mofo Project Object release, which has the original 1966 stereo mix. The album opens up in just about the best way you could open up an album, and one of the best ways to open up an entire discography, with Hungry Freaks Daddy. You have a great riff, very Stonesy. In fact, it's a lot like the riff to Satisfaction, although it's not the same riff. And some of the best socially conscious lyrics that Zappa wrote during the 60s. He's really ripping into the conformity and the vapidness of contemporary American culture. And it's also got a fantastic guitar solo in the midsection. Although, due to the fact there was another guitarist, a guy named Elliot Ingber, in the Mothers at the time, it's not always clear who plays what on this album. This track is much more typical of the sound of the first disc of Freak Out than Hungry Freaks Daddy. Effectively, it's just a deconstructed rock song of the day with goofy satirical lyrics about how the singer doesn't want to be in a relationship because he doesn't want to be tied down and have to get rid of the groovy lifestyle he's engaging in at the moment. Who Are the Brain Police is a certified Zappa classic. In some ways, maybe the most enduring song on this entire album. And it's also the other track on disc 1 that absolutely has nothing to do with anything else that was happening in popular music at the time. This track is a psychedelic nightmare that establishes this weird, uncomfortable atmosphere right from the get-go, with that droning bass and the weird vocals, which are even stranger on the original mix of the album, because they have this weird reverb added to them, with lyrics that are very vague, although they've been argued to be about everything from the police state to organized religion. This is already an unsettling song even before this happens. So we follow up that with one of the very first entries in a favorite Zappa genre, the satirical Doo-Wop song. In this case, it's about a jilted lover refusing to take back his cheating ex. Or at least you'd think it was up until you get to the ending monologue, which reveals a very different story. This is not a track that I skip very often, but it is one of my least favorite songs on the album. Once again, very basic, the rock sound of the time. It's essentially, as Zappa says in the liner notes, an advertisement to prospective groupies, informing them of the prowess of the Mothers. And despite some vocal puns in the lyrics, I definitely think it's one of the lesser tracks on this album. Well, as I said, most of disc 1 is just a parody of contemporary popular music. There are 2 tracks on here that basically just are contemporary popular music. And How Could I Be Such a Fool is the first of these tracks. It's basically just Zappa's take on contemporary R&B breakup songs, with some fantastic orchestral flourishes and some lyrical choices that I used to think were overdramatic and satirical, until I actually listened to some 50s and 60s R&B breakup songs and realized that he's really not exaggerating that much. Wowie Zowie is a pretty blatant attempt at a novelty song, and like all classic examples of novelty songs, it will linger in your head for weeks on end. In fact, I would be willing to guess that with different lyrics more acceptable for general consumption, and possibly with better promotion, this maybe could have been a minor hit.
And you didn't try to call me.
You Didn't Try to Call Me is another Doo-Wop parody, very much in the same vein as Go Cry on Someone Else's Shoulder, and once again, I love Zappa's take on Doo-Wop. I love his backing vocals, I love the ridiculous lyrics, I love the extra instrumentation, and the incredibly melodramatic take on a really very minor inconvenience. Although, by the way, the ending of this song is one of the single biggest differences between this mix and the 1987 remix. Because whereas the 1987 remix has a fade out, this just ends.
We're gonna go out and get some root beer afterwards, man. I was gonna show everybody my new carburetor, and you didn't try to call me.
Anyway, the Wind Blows is the other song on this album that is basically just contemporary 60s pop rock with slightly different lyrics, or even just with a different arrangement. I could easily see this having been a song by some one-hit wonder along the West Coast. Frank had a very brief marriage in the early 60s that ended in divorce around the time that Freak Out was being recorded, and this song is apparently about his feelings at the end of that marriage. I'm Not Satisfied has got to be my favorite out of all the satirical R&B songs on the first side of this album. It's just those lyrics, and of course the backing vocals. Yeah. They are so overblown and ridiculous, so melodramatic, such a caricature of the songs of the day about being sad that no one will love you. Honestly, that's one of the brilliant things about this track, is that even though the musical form it is tied to is completely dated to the mid-60s, the satirical lyrics are still a fantastic mockery of overdramatic songs about people being sad that nobody loves them. Side 1 ends on a great note with "You're Probably Wondering Why I'm Here." Again, contemporary rock style, but with parodic lyrics, really laying into the contemporary youth culture of the time, and what contemporary American society considered were wholesome and good activities. But beyond that, I think there's a bit of tongue-in-cheekness aimed at us, the listener here, as though Zappa is acknowledging that, yeah, this first disc isn't exactly that wild or that out there or that crazy for something that blatantly has Freak Out in the title.
Wednesday I watched the riot, I seen the cops out on the street.
Trouble Every Day opens up the second disc of the album, and it is a fantastic track. Famously, it's the one that got them signed to Verve by Tom Wilson, and you can totally understand why a guy who's been working with Dylan for the last year and a half would be so into something like this, because there's Dylan influence all over this track, even if the lyrics are far more blunt than anything Dylan ever did after 1964. The lyrics are pretty intense for the time, and you get the feeling almost that it's not so much the lyrics to a song as an angry rant about race relations in America set to music.
Hey, you know something, people? I'm not black, but there's a whole lot of times I wish I could say I'm not white.
It's about a very specific incident, the Watts riots of 1965 in LA, but the sad thing about this track is that this could come out today and you wouldn't have to change a single line in it. On the original vinyl issues of Freak Out, Help I'm a Rock and It Can't Happen Here are rolled into one piece. But for whatever reason, they've been billed as separate tracks on pretty much every subsequent reissue of the album. Even though they are connected and they're very much of a part, even if that larger bit is pretty evenly divided into two clear separate parts. Help I'm a Rock is much more musical and consists of basically a simple riff being played over and over again while increasing levels of chanting, weird stories, and other strange background noise escalate over it. This continues until it reaches about the 5-minute mark, which is where the track transitions into It Can't Happen Here. Essentially a very strange, off-kilter, off-key a cappella piece about I think, social unrest and upheaval and the freak counterculture of LA that Zappa was very heavily identifying himself with at the time of this album's release. Honestly, I do find the It Can't Happen Here part of the track a little weaker than the Help 'Em a Rock bit, but there are still some great lines in It Can't Happen Here. I particularly like the bits about who could imagine that they would freak out in Minnesota or Kansas or Washington, D.C.
Susie?
Yes.
Susie cream cheese?
And so the album ends with the 12-minute piece, The Return of the Son of Monster Magnet, taking up the entirety of side 4 as basically the first extended Zappa piece. And this is one where it's hard to tell if it's good or not, because what is present on the record is apparently the rhythm and backing track to a much more elaborate piece that was never actually completed. Supposedly they had finished the basic track for this piece, and then MGM Verve decided that the Mothers had spent enough of their money. I'd take you through this piece bit by bit, but I'll be honest in that only the first 2 pieces of it really have a structure in my opinion. The first part, of course, begins with the very famous Susie cream cheese dialogue before going into something that I find very difficult to actually describe, which transitions into
America's wonderful. Wonderful, 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 wonderful. It really makes it.
Before the album ends with what sounds like a bunch of random pounding on a keyboard and sped up voices. Freak Out is a lot of things to a lot of people, but for me personally, this album has always been a gateway. Because I started my journey with music in a very different place from a lot of people, but there was still this closed-mindedness about me for a long time. You know, I took things very seriously. I was very closed to the idea of, you know, humor or silliness in music, or even the idea that you could have interesting music and experimental music that didn't necessarily follow the rules, that just existed, that wasn't melodic, it wasn't prog, it wasn't any of the things that I was into at the time. And I'll always remember the day in autumn of my junior year of high school where I listened to this album for the first time, and I loved the first half of it, but the second half I wasn't really sure what to think of. You know, it took me a long time to get into the last 2/3 of disc 2 of Freak Out. I struggled for a long time with the last 3 tracks, or if you're going by the track listing I've used in this review, the last 2 tracks. But, you know, I kept at it. Over the course of the next couple years, I eventually got so I could listen to the whole album without skipping a track, and I loved all of it. Even the random keyboard smashing at the end of The Return of the Son of Monster Magnet. This is an album that really, really changed the way I look at music. It changed the way I think about music. It changed my entire outlook on popular music. And I think there's a lot of people who would agree. You know, Freak Out isn't the most influential album to have come out in 1966. In fact, of my top albums for 1966, which are Revolver, Pet Sounds, Freak Out, and Blonde on Blonde, the orders switch with those two pretty much day to day, and then Face to Face by the Kinks. Out of all those, Freak Out is probably the least influential. But at the end of the day, Freak Out isn't even the best Zappa album. It's part of the reason Blonde on Blonde might win over Freak Out some days in terms of which do I like more, is that Blonde on Blonde's a better Bob Dylan album than Freak Out is a Frank Zappa album. Freak Out is very much the beginning of a journey, even though he's mostly there thematically, you know, because of the Mothers being what they were, particularly this lineup of the Mothers. The 60s Mothers were always held back to a certain extent by the playing abilities of certain members. I think Jimmy Carl Black and Roy Estrada in particular. But on later albums, Zappa was able to get around that by hiring new players. After this album, he picked up a lot of classically trained people. He picked up a lot of jazz musicians. And, you know, the playing ability of the band goes up dramatically right after Freak Out. You know, by Absolutely Free, the improvement is already there. But because of that issue, you know, this album is mostly songs. And the extended pieces are weird. I suspect that they are probably written pieces, because I don't think Zappa did many improvs of anything, but they have a sloppiness and a looseness to them that makes them seem like they aren't written pieces. And, you know, so this is almost the only Frank Zappa album that someone who is into the other side of experimental music, to the more Velvet Underground side of experimental music, could probably enjoy.